Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. I'm Julie Joyce. I'm the Curator of Contemporary Art, and I'm so pleased that you're joining us here this afternoon for one of our very special programs in conjunction with Labor and Weight, the exhibition that opens to the public on July 2nd, but we will actually, just for you, we're going to be open a little bit for an hour or so after the lecture ends. So if any of you would like to come upstairs and take a preview, a sneak peek of the exhibition, you're welcome to do that. I'm very honored to be able to be presiding over this panel today. It's going to be a little bit different. I'm just going to introduce the artists and then they will speak because we always want to hear more from artists than someone like me. But before that, I just wanted to say a few things. There are many people who were involved in this project and shed their blood, sweat, and tears over it throughout. It's been a great effort on behalf of the entire staff of the museum, and they are all responsible and all a participant in this process. And so I do want to acknowledge them. And I think they're all hopefully taking a vacation today, except for a few people in the audience, because they've all worked very hard. I also want to thank the artists, many of whom are here today. I wish they could all speak, but I know we didn't have quite enough time for them all to speak. Also, I want to thank the supporters of the exhibition. The exhibition is made possible through the generosity of the Luria Family Foundation, SBMA's The Museum Contemporaries, our contemporary support group, and many of you are here today, so I appreciate seeing your faces. SBMA's Women's Board, who has been an enthusiastic, one of the museum's, or perhaps the oldest support group for the museum, and the most venerable and tried and true, and they keep on going, which fascinates us all, and for which we are very grateful. Jill and John C. Bishop, Jr., Cindy Howard, Just Folk, Susan Barrowald and Marcy Carsey, the LLWW Foundation, Jane and Ken Anderson, Susan D. Bowie, and Elizabeth and Gregory Fowler, and Patricia Aoyama and Chris Cleveland. All of these individuals and institutions have generously contributed to this project, making it possible. I also wanted to bring up the fact that there are many really fantastic education and outreach programs related to the exhibition. This panel, of course, where we can feature the artists. We also have a forthcoming lecture by the eminent Grayson Perry, who's coming from London on Sunday, July 28th. And then the final lecture type activity is Jenny Sorkin and Julia Bryan-Wilson, two scholars on the specific topic of craft and contemporary art, who will be coming the last day of the exhibition. So I hope you'll join us for all of these. It should be very fascinating and interesting aspect that can add to your experience. I also want to point out that we have most, if not all, of these programs listed in this brochure, which is available at the front desk, also on our website. And for families and children, we did something special this time. We have Allison Smith, who's going to be speaking here today. She designed or redesigned not only the physical space of our Family Resource Center, but also the programming. And so we're very excited to be opening that very soon. She's been working very hard on not just that, but also her piece upstairs, Stockpile, which I'm sure you'll be impressed by. And then last but not least, we also have, for people who want to come with children, we have these great little family guides for kids to kind of occupy themselves with finding treasures throughout the exhibition. So on to my introduction for the artists. I'm just going to say a little bit about them. Colin Darke is an artist originally from England, but living in the north of Ireland since 1988. Exhibitions include Manifesto 3 from 2000, the Venice Biennale from 2003, the Busan Biennale from 2004. Several years ago, he returned to school studying at the University of Ulster in Belfast, where he received his PhD. His research concerned the examination of art production from the perspective of the relationships between economics, history, and ideology. I'm going to quote just a little bit from a review of his exhibition at the Temple Bar Gallery in Dublin, which was in, I believe, 2010. Is that right, Colin? About that? 2008. I apologize. I couldn't find the year on that. Okay, quote, Colin Darke's two-part project, Capital, explores price, value, symbolic exchange, and what happens when the ordinary is elevated into art. Part 1, exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2003 and Context Galleries in Derry in 2005, saw Darke, painstakingly transcribe the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Das Kapital onto the surface of 482 dimensional objects. The fine, spidery writing and the nature of the artist's labor, which is seldom, if ever, valued on a cost-per-hour basis, transformed the detritus of consumer society, adverts, post-it notes, religious cards, packaging, into something with a quantifiable exchange value, to be exhibited in the rarefied atmosphere of the Contemporary Gallery and to be subsequently sold. 5 years later, the Capital paintings at Dublin's Temple Bar Gallery, and this is the work that's upstairs on view in the show, completes the transformation of ephemera into art as the artist has painted each object from Capital onto a separate A4 canvas, minus the handwriting, and with that has made the mass-produced unique. Our next artist, and we'll go alphabetically, is Allison Smith. And Allison Smith's practice investigates the cultural phenomenon of historical reenactment and the role of craft in the construction of national identity. She produces performative sculptures and public events that provoke new forms of popular militancy by encouraging participants to take history into their own hands. Smith received her BA in psychology from the New School for Social Research, a BFA in sculpture from the Parsons School of Design, and an MFA from the Yale University School of Art. She has also participated in the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program and produced solo exhibitions and projects for institutions including the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Berkeley Art Museum, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, and the Indianapolis Museum of Art, among others. And I'm reading here from Mary McGuire's entry in our Labor and Weight catalog, quote, excuse me, Smith's unique installation of Stockpile for Labor and Weight reiterates the nexus of colonialism, fabrication, reenactment, and sculptural performance that each articulation of the work presents anew. The changeability of the installation lends the work an ephemeral quality even in its material sturdiness. Inherent in Smith's work is a sense of disorientation, chaos, and eventual loss, as in a stockpile that is bound to collapse or immolate. And last but not least, we will also hear from Jane Wilbraham, who was born in Shropshire, the United Kingdom, and studied at the Ruskin School of Drawing and Fine Arts, the Slade School of Art. She spent the early 90s on a residency at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, and she lives and works in London. She has shown at the British Museum in London, the New Art Gallery in Walsall, and she exhibits regularly at Hales Gallery in London. Her work is included in various private and public collections, including the International Collage Centre, the British Museum, UBS, and Oxford University. Wilbraham's sculptural practice is deliberately hermetic, extensive, repetitive, and perversely time-consuming so that she can use this making time as a contemplative exercise. Her motifs arise from her relationship with the urban environment, political economic discourse, as well as from a traditional folk art canon. Most of Wilbraham's carvings, and this is again according to Mary McGuire in our exhibition catalog, are made of sycamore, which for the artist contains specific historical and political connotations. Beyond its abundance in the wooded areas near the artist's studio in South London, the sycamore tree is known for its fecundity even in polluted urban areas. Wilbraham has noted that the sycamore, quote, is a difficult tree to destroy. After World War II, it is said anecdotally that if left uncleared, many of the bomb sites in London could have turned to sycamore forest in 5 years, given its spread and opportunism, end quote. Its robustness and prevalence echoes Wilbraham's persistent political investment in the seemingly outdated or inconsequential art of whittling. And so with that, I will introduce our first speaker, and they will just come up one by one and speak for 15 minutes, and then we will either open it up to questions or they will question each other, which sometimes can be far more fascinating. So our first artist is Colin Darke.
Thank you. I do get a bit nervous about this sort of thing sometimes, so please excuse me if I do. And also, I still haven't yet got over my jet lag, so if my voice reduces to a murmur or mumble, please shout out and I'll correct. When I've talked about my work before, I've often started by saying I'm not a political artist, and people just laugh at me when I say that because the work is, the content of the work and the theoretical basis for it is clearly political. So, but what I mean when I say that is that there's no real polemic, there's no propagandist agenda. So, having said that, we'll go through. Okay, this is, as we heard, I moved to Ireland in '88. And I moved because I was dissatisfied with the way the work was going, and I thought a change of environment would help, so I went off to the war zone in the north of Ireland. I moved to Derry, and while there, after a while, a bit of experimentation, I then discovered the Con, which is a letters that were sent by Republican political prisoners. They used to write them on cigarette papers in very small writing, which they then folded up, wrapped in saran wrap, and then passed them to visitors in a kiss. And I found this really interesting because I was interested in making work that looked at the relationship between socialist politics and Republican politics. And so it gave me a good opportunity for that because I had something which was essentially Republican form onto which I could then put left-wing ideas. So this is Reform and Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg, written onto a number of cigarette papers. This then led me, I'm going to go through this quickly because I want to concentrate on the work that's in the show. This led me to working on directly onto the walls. So I was then sort of taking it away from the politics of the Troubles and into sort of the idea of the politics of the art gallery system. Which then led me to wall drawings. This is in Ljubljana, and it's a copy of a painting by a little-known French artist called Charles Landel, and it's called The Republic. And what I've done is I've stretched the image to fit, so it's kind of that dimension really, and I stretched it to fit the wall. And this was, like the last piece really, thinking about, it's based on which I won't go into, what Marx termed as basic superstructure theory, which looked at the sort of the notion of the determination of ideology, art, culture, politics, etc. The determination of those things by economic structure of society. So I was kind of questioning the idea of artistic autonomy, and so I was sort of surrendering a level of autonomy. So I was given a wall, and then I fit the image to fit the wall that I was given. There's a bit of text in there as well, you can see, which is a lecture by Trotsky. So there's a detail. This is charcoal drawn directly onto the wall. So this is capital, which you heard about. It's where I transcribed capital, das Kapital, onto 480 two-dimensional objects, which were then laminated. And there's number one, the first one, which is a £5 note. So you can see again, I'm using very small writing. So there's still, although the direct reference to Irish politics has gone, the small writing, it gives it a sort of an indirect reference to the Troubles. While I was doing this, of course I was reading as I was going along, and I found in volume 2, there's a point where Colin talks about something that was actually very important. And it's what made it distinct from previous economists, was that he pointed out that, I'm sorry about this, but I have to say this because it explains why I went on to painting. He divided commodity production into two departments, where Department 1 is the production of means of production, Department 2 is means of production, production of the means of consumption. In other words, Department 1 is like raw materials, tools, plant machinery, and Department 2 is things that we buy in shops. And the relationship between those two things is very important for the accumulation, which is essential for the continuation of capitalist production. So, when I read that, it made me think of Duchamp's ready-mades, and made me think of it in a very different way, because previous to the ready-made, art, like any other production, was based on that same thing, that you buy things from Department 1 and you make things for Department 2. So Monet would go in and buy paints and easel and canvas and pencils, which were Department 1 commodities, and then he'd produce a painting for sale, and that was Department 2 one. With Duchamp, with a ready-made, instead of that strict 1-2 thing, what he did was by buying a ready-made object, it was a Department 2, and then at the point of purchase, it became Department 1, and then as soon as it was his, it became Department 2 again. So it transformed into a completely different object, even though physically it was the same thing. So looking at my capital, I realised that some of them are ready-made and some of them aren't, because most of them are Department 2 things, but some of them were, like there's a sheet of paper, there's a sculptor's scraping tool, some which are a bit unsure, like a tea bag, I'm not sure whether that's Department 1 or Department 2. So they were unequal, I realised, and that made me feel a bit uncomfortable, so I thought, well, I have to do another piece which equalises them. And the only way I could think of doing that was to go to a pre-Duchampian means of production, which was painting oil paint on canvas. So then I set about making a painting of each of these objects. It was a 4-year process, so they're 480 paintings. And this is what's upstairs. So just some comparisons, that's from capital, and that's the painting. What I like as well is that it kind of throws up different art styles, if you like. So there's pop art in there, there's landscape, there's portraiture. so all of those things are sort of contained within it, but through pure accident. Of course, I wasn't thinking of that at the time. Right, so as Julie said, I went back to school and did my PhD, and that's right what it was about. It was actually dominated by research into Bertolt Brecht's theory of epic theatre, and this piece was actually made for my PhD show, and I wanted to make a Brechtian work. And again, there isn't time to go into some of the details about this, but this was, I found a piece of film, just 2.5 seconds, of Lenin giving a speech. And I use this because, well, because it was a reference to Brecht, it had to be kind of overtly political kind of imagery, so this was perfect for it. So 2.5 seconds was 60 frames, and I managed to break it down into those frames and then made a painting from each one. And as you can see, the way it's done, it's sort of, I made my own kind of paint-by-number paintings, and this is part of a reference to Brecht, really, obliquely. Okay, so these are the 60 paintings. So this first one, these are the 60 paintings in a grid. What I did was, where, you can see here where the two screens are, I placed a stills camera in those two positions, and photographed it, and then moved each painting one place. So that first one had to come down. That first one had to come down, and then each one was moved one place, and then the first one became the last one. Photographed it again with those cameras, and then did it again and again and again, 60 times, and took it back to the way it was at the beginning. So I had to hang this thing 60 times. But, so then I made animations from those photographs. This one's close-up one, of course, and then this one of the whole thing. And you can see, in fact, the camera within this, which is another kind of Brechtian device of revealing the nature of the making of the object. So, hopefully this is going to work. So this is one of the animations. It was a really risky business, and I went through all that process, and I didn't really know whether it was going to work, so you can imagine my relief when it did. Okay. Now, what had happened here, because I'd never been a painter before capital paintings, but I found myself thinking of myself as a painter, and I felt really uncomfortable about that. And so I was working then to get myself out of that thought process. So I made these photo montages. So this is, well, I actually cut text into apples and then put a montage them. But at this point, this was actually like a mock-up for a painting, which is why there's canvas on the back of canvas. This is a reference to paintings that were made by Gustave Courbet in 1871 after he was imprisoned for his part in the Paris Commune uprising. When he was in prison, he was given apples by his sister when she came to visit, and he painted paintings of them, and this was very unusual for Courbet to do this kind of still life painting. But the apples in the paintings, if you look at them, are starting to rot. And so it's thought that, you know, that the Paris Commune ended up with a massacre of 40,000 people. And so the last time he'd seen Paris before he was in prison, it was littered with dead bodies. And so it's thought that these apples are metaphors for those bodies. So I made a number of these things. This is, text on this is a proclamation by the Commune. And the title is a reference to a Courbet painting. So this is a painting I found of some communards after the massacre. And then the red image in the middle is from 68 Paris, so it's kind of making a kind of historical connection. And you can see that they've made barricades with cars, so each apple, there's one apple on each car. But what I like about it is that they look like they're floating and flying out of the image. So then I did a residency, I think, in Paris, sorry, in Rome, which gave me kind of the opportunity to move away from painting it. So I finally found my way through that period. This first one is a poem by Arthur Rimbaud about the Vatican. And it's just painted onto, this is a live ivy. This was the first thing I did in Rome, and I was just struck by the amount of ivy that was in classical painting as well as the coronet sort of make. So I just wrote it onto the thing. It was a 6-month residency. It was still there when I left. It might still be there now. I don't think so. Okay, so back to the apples. Again, this is a poem by Rambo, Le Mandat Jean-Marie, which is a poem celebrating the activities of women during the Commune. And you can see that the weather at this time in Rome was much like it is here now. So it didn't take long for them to rot away. You can see on this one here that it's actually started to liquefy here. So the content refers directly to the Commune, and the apples themselves refer to Courbet's work at that time. I've done 2 others, bigger and I think better. I couldn't access the images, I'm afraid. And then this one, if I've got time to talk about this one. Okay, quickly then. This was very much kind of a site-specific piece. I found that where I was in the British School at Rome, and I found that in 1968 there was in fact the 1st of March 1968, there was a student demonstration just outside the building and across this big road that goes up to a park, which turned into a riot. And as part of that demonstration, there was across the road from the British School where I was, up to this park where the ivy thing is, in fact, there's these steps. The steps go up, and then there's a platform that goes out, and then it goes up again to the park. And there's a photograph I found of this demonstration, which was a kind of a standoff between the students who were on the platform, or the level area, and the police that were at the bottom of the stairs. And this standoff lasted for a while, and then it ended up as what's become known as the Battle of Valley Julia. And what happened was, when I was first there, in February, there was a sudden cold snap, this really heavy snowfall in Rome, and the steps and this flat area covered in snow, which quickly became impacted. And then the weather changed very quickly. Suddenly it was very hot, the snow melted very quickly. What happened was that the tarmac on this area had cracked and broken up. And so I went up in the cover of darkness and gathered all this tarmac and made this text piece with it, which is a poem by Pasolini about the Battle of Valley Julia, which he wrote immediately. It was published in a left-wing newspaper about a week later. And it was a real shock because he says in it that he supported the police and not the students. He supported the police because they were from poor working-class backgrounds, and the students were spoiled rich kids. And really bad politics. It's rather foolish, and it caused an uproar, and it still remains a topic of argument to this day. So it was a perfect opportunity to make a site-specific work. And that's me.
Hello, everyone. I'm Allison, and I just want to thank Julie and the museum and the other artists in the show. I'm really so proud to be in this show. A lot of my favorite artists are in this show, so it's been a great experience. So to give you a little bit of background on my practice, I grew up on the East Coast in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I think I have a very particular relationship to craft, and that's one of the sort of entry points that I have to this group of artists and this exhibition concept. And throughout several projects, I've been interested in economies of art and economies of craft as well.
I won't be talking about those projects specifically today, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of projects that kind of reveal my interest in the connection between craft and war. I grew up in an area where there were lots of historic homes and living history museums like Colonial Williamsburg, and even country craft fairs where people would dress in historic costume and perform what I later came to think of as a kind of performance of nationalism through making. In these sites, you can learn how to do weaving, you can learn tinsmithing and blacksmithing, but you can also learn how to load a gun. And I became really interested in that connection. In my own family, my mother is an early American craft enthusiast and an early Martha Stewart acolyte. So, in our household, we were always, making things, decorative painting, all kinds of needlework, things that I would later come to understand through my, feminism classes in college as women's work. So she really introduced me to art for the first time through various forms of early American craft reproduction. My father's also a craftsperson. He makes kites and model airplanes and steam engines, kind of a humorously gendered compliment to my mother in many ways. He also worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, which I'm not really supposed to tell you, but I can't keep it a secret anymore. But he just retired, so I don't feel so bad. But he makes spy gadgets, spy gear, things that look like one thing but function in a very different way, either to conceal messages or gather information or things like that. And so between the kind of, patriotic American house beautiful that was sort of my mother's presentation and the kind of dark underbelly of, what my dad was up to with his work, I'm very much a sort of product of both of my parents. And we actually lived in Iran for a period of time when I was a child. And I didn't know till after September 11th that this was actually a black site. If any of you have seen the film Argo, we were in Iran at that same time and, were evacuated in a similar fashion to some of the characters in that film. And so this was a place that was just, for a child, it was so rich. It was a beautiful landscape, really kind of this exotic place, so far away and so mysterious and magical. And yet when we returned, I was never ever supposed to speak of it. So I've always had a kind of longing for the Middle East, and so as these things have, as world politics have unfolded, over the past, 10, 20 years, I also think of myself as having a kind of very specific, very conflicted, relationship to those things. So when I was in New York in the early 90s, I was looking at a lot of artists who were exploring issues of identity politics, and specifically the idea of the performativity of identity. And so I started doing my own kind of ethnography of the Civil War reenacting community. It's a community that I sort of interfaced with as a child, going to battle reenactments and things like that. And I was really curious about this idea of performing masculinity and whiteness and nationalism. And so I started kind of studying this as part of my practice. And I was also in New York during September 11th, and that was another thing that had a big impact on my work. So around 2004, 2005, I had been making a lot of sculptures and objects kind of in this sort of period room-like setting where I was interested in what viewers might project onto a space, what kinds of historical narratives, what kinds of contemporary narratives, what they would really perform in a space. And in 2004, I decided to actually try to organize my own battle reenactment. One of the things that I envy, I guess you could say, about reenactors is their ability to create these very, very large-scale events that are made of thousands of tiny kind of handmade details. If any of you have done reenactments or have anyone in your family who's done that sort of thing, you probably know, or even if you've read about it, that historical reenactors are really obsessed with the way things are made. How many stitches on the sole of a boot, how many threads per square inch of the fabric that's used for the uniforms. And so I got interested in this realm as a kind of alternate art world or a parallel art world, and trying to think about these as, initially very conservative, performances, but then the more I sort of met and interfaced with people doing that, the more it kind of complicated, my preconceptions. So in this battle reenactment that I organized, instead of pitting two sides against one another and instead of reenacting a battle that was already, the outcome was predetermined, I decided to organize it around a question, which is, what are you fighting for? And I invited everyone that I knew to fashion uniforms and build campsite installations reflecting their favorite causes. So the first muster took place in 2004 on the land of some artists in the Poconos Mountains of Pennsylvania. There were about 75 participants. And that event led to a much larger scale muster that was actually in the New York Harbor, right next to the Statue of Liberty in Lower Manhattan, on an island called Governor's Island, which was a military base for over 200 years. And it's kind of this island that most New Yorkers hadn't ever stepped foot on, even though it's kind of right there. Right before I did this muster event there, the land itself was sold by the federal government to the people of New York for $1 US. And this was one of the first art projects to take place there, although since then a lot more art events and other projects and residencies have taken place out there. It's a really interesting island with a lot of history. It actually played an important role in every US war, I think up to World War II. So a muster is a military term meaning a gathering of the troops for the purposes of inspection, critique, exercise, and display. And I really liked the idea of trying to create an event that could do all of those things. So for this project, I did several broadsides that included, a call to art, poems by, Walt Whitman, timelines of the local history. And people could enlist through a website. And in this, there were 3 different versions of the project. In the second and largest one, there were about 125 enlisted participants and over 2,000 spectators. We had an encampment. I don't think I have any pictures showing an overview of the encampment, but there were about 40 to 50 campsites. And people were representing everything from grassroots political causes like ocean preservation, fighting to end AIDS. The youngest participant of the muster was 7 years old. She was fighting for pandas, as well as lots of artistic manifestos and things like that. This is a great project by an artist named Liz Collins, who at the time was also a professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. And she brought a whole army of knitters to the muster. And they used these manually operated knitting machines to knit yardage right onto the battlefield. And over the course of the day, this event, although it spanned about a week, was only open to the public for 1 day. And during that day, they knit this enormous kind of abstraction of an American flag. And then in the foreground is actually Julia Bryan-Wilson, who will be speaking about craft later on in the exhibition. She was reading from texts about knitting in wartime. And this was one of the ideas that Liz was exploring, was that there's been a knitting craze throughout every American war. I mean, we have the great, knitting craze that's happening now too, but it used to be something connected to making socks and mittens for soldiers, and now it's, something you see in boutiques and on Etsy and things like that, but there seems to be this kind of disconnect there. A couple images of a previous version of the stockpile piece that I've installed upstairs. I think of this piece as a collection, almost like a hoarding of early American colonial craft reproductions. The process for making this piece, and I've done a lot of other sculptural works, and I play a lot with scale in my works as well. So I hope you'll be able to see some other projects some other time. But with this piece, I was interested in the idea of how we might project ourselves as craftspeople into the world by ordering kits to create these colonial craft furniture pieces. So I went online and I started ordering sort of all of these kits, kind of like IKEA, where you can, get the feeling of participating in the building or creating of some furniture, but really you're just kind of assembling the furniture. And I was amused by the idea that with this, you're kind of playing the craftsperson, but you have to kind of, participate in this really kind of strange economy around it, because when I received a lot of these kits in the mail, they would be stamped, on the underside, made in Malaysia, made in Thailand, made in Brazil, India, China, kind of all over the world. So I was interested in this idea of a kind of outsourced American colonial craft aesthetic. And I've been told that the configuration upstairs is a bit like Les Mis, which I guess is a reference to the, back to the French Revolution and everyone taking their furniture and domestic objects and piling it up into a big barricade. Either that or Pirates of the Caribbean, the Disney ride. And the version upstairs is a lot more explicit. I had a lot of fun with that, but you'll see in this version too, there's like a grapevine wreath that is a life preserver. There are stools and other objects that resemble radio towers, satellite dishes. I was trying to sort of evoke a sense of paranoia, almost like these are symbols that are so kind of fleeting and fragile that I'm trying to create a portrait of the person who's kind of desperately clinging or holding on to some semblance of a kind of early American sense of origins or identity or authenticity. And yet everything is very contemporary and sort of ready to be used and ready to be painted, and it's clearly not a bunch of antiques. It's clearly things that are made in the present, but through their form are meant to evoke the past. For this project called Fancy Work from 2010, I was interested in the history of a certain genre of quilt making from the early 1800s that was developed right around the time of the invention of the kaleidoscope. So these are quilts. There was a woman named Rebecca Scattergood Savory, a Quaker woman, who made this beautiful series of these quilts. And what was innovative about them was that she kind of took this design and let it kind of go off the edges of the quilt, almost like shock waves that couldn't be contained. And I was interested with this piece in looking at a kind of pre-modern psychedelic abstraction and thinking about the idea of the psychedelic light show as a wartime folk art form, one that's both about escape and consciousness raising at the same time. So this piece is stitched quilt top. It's about 27 by 27 feet. And I was interested in treating it like a projection screen. So across from that is this colonial wall sconce. It's about 12 feet high, and it actually spins. So you can actually, as a viewer, kind of spin this mirrored piece. It's kind of like an inverted disco ball, but at the scale of a satellite dish. And both of these objects are from a period in early American decorative arts history called American Fancy, which is kind of theorized as being a moment where Americans were trying to stake out their own kind of aesthetic identity in interior design. It's sort of like the earlier version of Martha Stewart, you could say, which was a break from a more European kind of neoclassical style. So there were really swirling psychedelic ceramics and, optical floor paintings and lots of patterning on the walls, these lighting fixtures that scattered light across the room. It's very psychedelic and very, very colorful. So along with that piece, this is a kind of example of how I like to create sculptures that then there's a kind of interaction in the making of or in the activation of, or kind of a transformation of the object from one context to the next. So for this installation, I did a whole series of programs inviting people to engage with ideas around the sculptures. For example, this was a crazy quilting workshop where people could make their own quilts using scraps from the large quilt that I made. There was a West Coast scholar on psychedelic light shows and an early light show pioneer who came and spoke. Cleve Jones, the founder of the Names Project, the memorial AIDS quilt, came and talked about the notion of a quilt as a battlefield. And other issues of kind of conflict and mourning throughout. In the following iteration of this project at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, I continue to take these scraps from the quilt and create a braided rug. And I started this at about 8 feet in the gallery, and then visitors to the gallery could continue to actually braid onto the rug. And then it became a kind of platform for conversation and dialogue, again, around issues of this connection between craft and war, kind of the home front and front lines. And one of my long-term interests is in trench art, or objects made by soldiers. We're done?
Well,
okay, 1 minute. Great, that's great. Just at the end. So another great interest of mine is in trench art, objects made by soldiers on the battlefield or in hospitals, or sometimes in prisoner of war camps. These are some examples of decorated artillery shells from World War I that are made into flower vases. So in more recent projects, I've organized a lot of workshops looking at various types of trench art to engage the public, and particularly civilians and service members, in a dialogue about wartime, contemporary wartime experience. This is a kind of pin cushion that would have been made in World War I that is kind of reactivated in these workshops by participants. And then the culminating project recently for this project, which is called the Arts and Skills Service, after a World War II program in the Bay Area that did exist. We created this series of buntings for a fort that's right below the Golden Gate Bridge. So with each of the buntings, there's a swag and an individual ID tag. In this project, these were all portraits and quotes by women who've served in the military. So I've tried to kind of come, full circle with these ideas. And that's just a little display of some of my personal trench art objects. Okay, thanks.
I'm Jane. You have to excuse me if there's a glow coming off this corner. I've done what every English person needs to do when they go and walk. I'm horribly sunburned. I'm afraid we don't know what that yellow thing up in your sky is. If there's anywhere to join a club where we can worship it, I'm in. So, yeah. And thanks to Julie as well for this show, seconding Allison's, because it's really fantastic. I think the ambition of putting on a show which involves artists who work with stuff is either to be applauded, or she might need to go to what you might call a sanatorium for a significant period of time following this. But hopefully that's not going to be the case. So, but I'll start with a slide if I can. Pick something up. Right. This is now going to put you off horribly from going to my room upstairs, or you're going to be rushing up there. This is actually, you're not going to see anything like this. But I thought I might as well put the work in context for you, because you're not going to know what I do or who I am. I have showed in America before, a long time ago, in New York, and in fact showed work that was from this period. This is actually from 2003, and it was a public work I made actually quite a lot of big public projects. Prior to making the work that you're going to see upstairs, which is all wood carvings. And these works were made from found materials from close to where I lived. I made a decision kind of quite early on that I wanted to work with materials that I could pretty much source from outside my doorstep within a mile or two, very much in the spirit of Rauschenberg and Schwitt as an artist that I particularly admired. I thought this was a pretty good way of working for cheap. Finding cheap material, especially if you're quite poor, and I don't really want to spend a lot of money. I'm probably quite tight, so that was it. But this is a piece from 2003, which was called Small Shop Within a Big Shop. The photograph on your left is actually Lewisham Market, which is in southeast London. It's a very mixed demographic area. My husband and I like to joke that it's an anthropological experience going down there, one that everyone should experience at some point in their life. But a lot of the boxes came from markets. Well, it came from Lewisham Market and also from Deptford Market, which was where my studio was at the time in southeast London. This was a project that, as I say, was a culmination of a period of work that I'd been making, which was very much collage-based, with found materials, with the cardboard boxes, which really helped me journey the world vicariously, because all this stuff was coming from all of these countries, to these markets. I could pick up this stuff on the ground, I could reconfigure it. It's hugely vibrant, there's with wonderful vernacular languages in it through the design of the boxes. And so it kind of took me places quite literally, even though I was working from what was outside my doorstep. Anyway, this project, yeah, 2003, it's a Trojan horse. In fact, all my public projects were Trojan horses. So there were things that looked like one thing but were very much another. This was in the middle of a big Safeway superstore, and it was actually just at the point where Safeway was being taken over by another big supermarket in Britain, so it was wonderful. I managed to get away with an awful lot, but they just didn't realise what I was doing, which suited me fine. So I took up a lot more floor space than they would have liked and cost them more money than it was actually costing to produce the sculpture. So that was the result. And because it was slightly personal as well, because I come from a background of small retailers. My father was a butcher, and it was a generational business, and his business was basically put out of business by the supermarkets. So it was payback. So I think I won that one. But anyway, I'd come to the end of really wanting to make this sort of work, and there were lots of reasons, but this felt very much like the culmination. This was a big project. I actually worked with a lot of school children. It was what we call a Section 106 in Britain, which I think you probably have the equivalent here, % for art, where large companies have to put a certain amount of money forward to do this. And there's a lot of community engagement and involvement. And I have to say, it makes me sound terribly antisocial, and I've done 3 of these projects, but I just really don't like working that way. I'm probably a bit of a control freak. And I'm afraid I do tend to use children, the church, or any other groups as a human shield, if I possibly can, to get some fairly contentious ideas across and have a pop. So it's probably quite good I don't really work like that anymore. I'd be in trouble or in jail. So but this project was a fantastic project to do. So it really felt to me like I was working with lots of children. They made all the products for the shop. It was slave labour. They got nothing from it. You know, what can I say? Yeah. Anyway, when I think of the market, though, everyone talks about the market now. When I think of the market, I think of the thing on the left. I can't think of some great bodiless leviathan of a financial thing that decides it's upset about something or gets a bit depressed every now and then. I think about that. So that's probably tells you more about me than anything else. Right, okay, this is a piece, I haven't got any dates or text on this. I have difficulty remembering when I made these things. I don't do sort of digital or technology. I had to get a 12-year-old to put this together because I sort of don't really know what I'm doing. Anyway, he said, do you want text on it? And I said, no. So that was a mistake. But this was from 2000 and... I'm looking for help. 2007, 8, something like that. And this is actually... leading on really, because I'd finished making the cardboard work. I felt like that piece really was the end of it. It just felt like a natural end as well, really, making something as big as that, and most of the work I had made hadn't been as big as that. It was just sort of the culmination of this great big thing. But I still wanted to, I mean, I've always had a great love of collage, and I think I have a collage sensibility. Actually, I think when I think about it, my life is probably collage. It's random bits and pieces stuck together, and most of it falling off part of the time. So it sort of suits me, and I tend to think like that, and yeah, it's something I love. And this work is called The Relentless March of Bricks and Mortar, and it's actually from a 19th century Cruikshank cartoon, satirical cartoon illustration, which was really about expressing during the middle of the 19th century the expansion of London, and thinking about it now, well, yeah, it was nothing then, but it was really about this idea of the brickworks and the spewing out bricks into what would have been the green belt in places like Brixton and Peckham, which are very, very urban now. And I took this cartoon, this satirical cartoon, as a starting point really for this piece, and I spent months travelling around London whenever I had a camera, well, I had my camera with me most of the time, photographing brick walls, which started some really great conversations with people. It really did, in the street, if you think about that. So the brick walls were photographed either close up, when I wanted small bricks, or far away. So it's kind of, yeah, that's how it came about. And all the brick photographs, which they were all hand printed, because at that time there wasn't digital printing, it was just prior to that really coming in, were just then collaged onto foam board and made a massive chain. I mean, it's a huge piece, but obviously it's gradational, it moves down in size. So that was sort of really where I was in about 2007, 2008. I was making collage work. There were lots of different areas I was going into, but I still was sort of, yeah, okay, working on it. This is a tenon saw, for those of you that don't know. So this is for hand woodworking. This is actually a really old saw which I inherited as part of a big collection of tools from my father, who died in 2002 actually, and my uncle, who died a little bit later. They were both butchers, as I said, but really didn't want to be, and were in a business really that they probably should have done something else but couldn't, because they had to take over the family business, and that's what you did. But there is cabinet making in my distant background and itinerant woodworking crafts, but this is really jobbing. It's about, you know, making things for manufacturing things for sale, really, so you could eat if you're in the countryside. It's one of the things that you did do. And then when that business started to die out, they went into the butchery business. But anyway, I inherited some tools. You can't really see this, so excuse the photograph, it's terribly bad. I'm going to just move over in here and point. It's actually just there and here and here. But this here, that bottom section, which if you just sort of focus on and squint, I sound terribly sorry about the quality of the photograph, it's one of mine. It says T. Wilbraham, but there are also two other names actually stamped into the handle of this. So that would be my great-grandfather, and he would have basically got that saw from somebody else who got it from somebody else prior to him, and that's what you did when you were apprenticed and when you were working. So the tools would have been handed down, so it would have been through two hands before he had it, probably in the it would have been the late 1800s by the time he got it. And you can see it's been kind of sharpened and reshaped to a very strange, eccentric shape. So you can't really use it now, but I'm sure he did. But anyway, I inherited a lot of these tools, and I'd had them sitting around, and I thought, what am I going to do with this? I don't quite know. Something will come to me, I thought to myself. Yeah, I did my first degree at Oxford. That sums it up. Yeah, I don't know, I was kind of out of place. I mean, yeah, it's a strange one, really. Yeah. As Adam, Julie's partner, said, we did a little trip to Oxford a year ago. Yeah, a year or so ago. Adam's exclamation when I took him to my old college was, "Jane, you went to school at Hogwarts!" Which I can assure you, I didn't. It was very much not like that. But it was an interesting experience, and I think what happened was that so much of what did happen for me there, which was deeply intellectually stimulating, I have to say, although I think I was completely out of my depth and didn't really know how to deal with it at the age of 21, 22. A lot of it stayed with me, but not the things that I might have expected, or that I might have expected. And this is a jump. This is a picture of, they're very big like that, it's odd to see them like that, and obviously I think you can probably gather they're spoons, and so they are quite intimately scaled. These are love spoons, which I'd love to say I owned, but I don't. These are in the St Fagans Museum, which is the national, what used to be called the Museum of Welsh Bygones, which I think they should have kept that name, but it's the National Museum of Folk Art in Wales, which is close to the area where I was brought up. I was brought up in Shropshire, which is on the marches between England and Wales, an area that was always sort of conflicted in terms of who actually owned it. And I was very familiar with this sort of work growing up and was really intrigued and drawn to it, and I think there are probably things in it that you will recognise. Obviously, in terms of the whittling tradition in America, there is the similarities. These things, actually, I don't think any of these are later than about 1850s, but they've got some in the collection that date back to the 17th century, so this is very early. And these things were made largely from sycamore, actually, because it was found in the area very predominantly. It could be worked quite easily in the green, although it's very hard, which means payoff being it's very hard wood, but you can get beautiful detail into it. And you can actually, if you wanted to, eat with it, because it's a wood that doesn't taint, although these things never were meant for consuming your food. They were tokens, generally accepted to be tokens of love. So things that men would carve for their intended, and often the things on them would be carved symbolically to mean particular things. We think, we don't know, I don't really think it's a pin-downable language actually, and I like that. But anyway, they're stunning things, and this was something I sort of started thinking about again after I'd been visiting home, well, Shropshire a bit more regularly. I still refer it as home, which is probably not a good thing considering I've lived in London for a long time, but I do consider that that's where I'm sort of, my heart probably does lie. And I've been visiting a lot more, and I picked up a couple of small books and pamphlets in a second-hand bookshop there, and I thought, you know, yeah, this stuff is sort of, this is interesting to me. I don't quite know why, but it's starting to kind of niggle at me a little bit. And I've got some tools, remember, I've inherited some tools. Okay, woods. This is literally outside my back gate. I'm very, very fortunate that having moved from South East London, where the markets, you know, were quite a kind of densely populated urban area, we now live in an area that's a little bit more suburban. It's actually still pretty much Greater London, central London, but it's just sort of on the edge of what you would call the really sort of heavily urbanised area. And we live on the Dulwich Estate, and you probably know it from the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which is one of the oldest art galleries. It's a big, big area, and they have a big public school there as well, but they have a lot of land, and they built some fantastic modernist estates in the 50s, which is why we moved there. Lots of architecture. But also, we're extremely lucky that we have private wood at the back of our garden. I literally go out of my small garden gate into this. It looks bigger and more impressive actually because it's not that big. And most of it is scrub and the remnants of large Victorian houses, gardens, and the ubiquitous sycamore tree. You can kind of see that 3 prongs there sort of in the middle of the photograph going, oh, that's some sycamore sticking out. So this is where all the wood comes from that I work with. I have a good relationship with the estate who allow me to basically cut any sycamore that I like because it's considered a weed, and which is great. So again, I'm collecting the material from pretty much just outside my door. If I can't go, you know, more than about 40-50 paces into the wood to get it, I don't generally bother. Although actually there's one piece upstairs that's made from lime, I should just say, and I am becoming a bit of a tart where wood collecting is concerned, and basically I'll take anything. So anything that's coming out of neighbours' gardens. I've got an apple tree seasoning out the front at the moment, I've got pear wood, and a big lime tree came down, so I immediately rang the estate and they said, yeah, go and pester the tree surgeons who really don't like me, because they just want to go and sell the wood and make money for firewood, so I go and irritate the life out of them. So anyway, that's why. I mean, but the sycamore is important because there is the link to the vernacular pieces which I showed you earlier, the love spoons, and also because it's a sort of disregarded wood in terms of carving and sculpture, and I quite like that. I mean, I'm not trying to be a master carver or bronze said man to belong to a very particular fine art carving tradition. I'm not, and I'm not that, and it would be kind of disingenuous to suggest that's what I was doing. I'm not. So I do quite like the fact that if I'm using wood that belongs to this particular language, it seems fitting and it seems right. It's bloody hard to work though, so actually working with the lime is a relief. I think I'm afforded that. I'm allowed to be able to work with something that's slightly easier to carve. But yeah, the majority of the work upstairs is sycamore wood, and most of it was carved green. There are a couple of bits that were carved seasoned, but it's a wood that really you need to carve when it's been pretty much soon after it's been cut. In fact, the coins upstairs were cut with the wood that was seasoned. But anyway, that's where it comes from. I cut it, I season it, I make it. I don't have assistants, it's just me, believe it or not. Okay, this looks huge. It's quite disconcerting. This is a small piece. It's only about this tall. And I suppose I should talk about size, because we know that size does matter. Apparently, I'm told. And this piece is called Feather Miasma. And it's called, in our house, The Feather and the Fart, which is probably more accurate, because it kind of is. And it really is, it shows you the way I work as well. I mean, this is 2 pieces pretty much stuck together. I mean, you know, the feather is there, the miasma is there, and these things. So it's not carved from one block. And I started off with this idea, and the wood told me what to do. I didn't. I don't work like that. I have. I really don't. I have several things I might be working on, and they are symbolic to me, or they have significance to me, and I'll be working on perhaps lots of different things, and then I will orchestrate things as they come together and as they seem fit and right for each other. But again, this came actually from looking at a lot of the satirical cartoons that I've been looking at from yeah, that I just like them. And I wanted to make something that was sort of the equivalent of a Bad Air. Again, this is about 2008, 2009. I don't need to explain why, do I? It's kind of obvious. We all know what happened. So I really wanted to make something that there had this Bad Air, and this piece kind of evolved from that, and the feather, yeah. I wanted to see how thin I could carve the sycamore, actually, so it was a personal challenge, and yeah, before it broke. And that's always the risk factor. I think I quite like the risk factor with this sort of work as well, actually seeing how far you can push it. Right, what else have we got? Oh yeah, so it was the first chain. I can't stand the word whimsy. Someone said this to me last night, oh, you're the whimsy carver. I know that it is what it's called, but we have this word whimsical, which is, you know, it's an insult. And actually, I don't think they're whimsical. I think they're the absolute opposite of whimsical. I think that they are deeply psychologically imbued things which have very, very deep significance. And I've learned more and more about it, and I've certainly become very, very entranced with it myself. And the more I've read, and I found the only book I could really find, because you write so well on this stuff here, we don't really think about it or value it in the same way in Britain, unfortunately. The book I found that really, really touched me was a book by Simon Bronner. I don't know if any of you are aware of his writing. I think he's based in Pennsylvania, but he writes a lot on the psychology of folk art and vernacular art, and he wrote a book on particularly chain carving, and he followed 4 elderly whittlers, carvers from Virginia mainly, I think, and he followed their story basically, why they'd taken it up again in old age after learning it as boys, why all of a sudden it became the impetus to do this sort of, you know, particularly chain carving. And so much of it seemed to be about feeling out of place in the world, or trying to adjust all of a sudden, perhaps after illness, old age, everything creeping up, you're suddenly aware of your own mortality and your place. And it's a riddle. I mean, they're riddles. And without sounding really cheesy, life's a riddle. And so the puzzle is in the work. And I do feel very much that it is this sort of journey. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I am on a journey. I haven't worked it all out yet. And, you know, my work jumps about, I jump about. My life's messy at times. It's kind of bits and bobs, as I said about the collage. And there's no station at the end of it. So I kind of really identified with that. And I thought it was beautiful. It's a beautifully written book, and it's a very moving book. And I wanted to see if I could do this. And I thought this is a language I really feel very drawn to. And I feel very drawn to it for lots of different reasons. And it's to do with my relationship, perhaps, with the art world, if you want to call it, give it a name, the art market, perhaps. But it's the sort of language that I think can afford me something that I really didn't think I found at art school at the time that I was at art school, which was the late 80s. And God, I had a lot of art school. From Oxford to the Slade to the Rijks Academy. And I didn't really feel I found my thing. And I sort of felt like I found my thing with this work. And certainly after picking up a knife and a stick in 2008, which is my response to what was happening, just sitting in the garden and, you know, making this huge piece which is upstairs, I've kind of got hooked. And I don't want to empty out this sort of work of its language. I'm deeply reverent of it, and I want to kind of make it honestly and with that sort of integrity, and I want to make wonderful, beautiful, enigmatic things that hopefully will touch people and say something. And I know you're not supposed to say that as an artist, but I'm afraid it's true. I've sort of given up feeling that I have to defend it anymore. But anyway, this was the first chain piece I made, and it's called It's No Use. Which is, yeah, well, I'll let you make of that what you will. This is another piece called Unfettered. This was bought by a banker, incidentally. This is industrial waste. Oh yeah, I just wanted to show you this one. These are 2 presents from my husband, but I think he's trying to tell me something. So this is 2 vernacular pieces from my collection, small collection of trees. This is a piece called Friendly, which was inspired by some old Friendly Society post heads that I saw at the Museum of English Rural Life. a couple more watercolours there. They're actually very small works. I make watercolours of sticks, lines of dirt or detritus, knots. Oh, I think that's it. Oh yeah, I thought I'd finish with this piece. It's called Screwed.
If you'd like to ask a few questions, we'll have the artists come up and just sit down for 10 or 15 minutes if you'd like to stick around. Any questions, or do the artists want to respond to each other? Since we have a shy audience.
You should make them work. We can't work the microphone anyway, sorry. Is that working? No, is it?
Okay. Yes, we have one brave question in the back.
To Allison Smith, did you also order the fabrics in your stockpile, or did you make them, or somebody make them to you?
Let's see. So the question was, did I order the fabrics in the stockpile piece, or did I make some of them? I believe just about all of the textiles that are in that piece are reproductions, and I've actually visited lots of living history museums and places like that, and just there's a lot of cottage industries in the reenactment world also doing kind of authentic reproductions of early American textiles. I have actually apprenticed myself with weavers, and I've tried to learn a lot of the same techniques. So from piece to piece in my work, you might see other textiles that I've done myself or worked with someone or designed. But I believe all the ones in that piece are reproductions.
Thank you.
Jill, yes.
I was actually rather taken by the fact that the two women spoke about their past and what their families did and how that kind of influenced your what they did now. But Colin, can I put you on the spot and just ask you?
What's the question?
Well,
Why didn't I
the
make
question
it?
was, could you tell us a little bit about your family, and did it really influence you? I mean, of course it did.
Yeah, of course it did. I mean, I can't think now. Well, I'm English originally. I grew up in Surrey, just outside of moved to London to go to college. In terms of my family, well, I don't think they had anything to do with it, to be honest. I mean, I was the first artist ever in my family, for one thing. So they were very supportive, but they were very supportive, but they didn't have a clue what I was up to. I mean, when I went to college back in the mid-70s, I first started, and I immediately started conceptual art. And so it was the mid-70s, so it was still not fairly new thing. And so I immediately, as soon as I went onto my first art school, I sat at the typewriter and drew graphs. And I remember my parents coming to see the show at the end of the year. And, what the hell? You were so good at drawing when you were a boy. So I don't know if that really answers the question.
So they didn't force you to become a banker.
No, well, I'm very grateful for that, yes.
Yes, one shy hand here in the fifth row.
I have a question for Allison. I'm just curious about the muster events and how they have a structure, but they're kind of open-ended. And I love the way they involve so many different kinds of people. Do you have any more events of that nature in the works?
Yeah, so I do have a part of my practice, doing projects in galleries and museums that are much more static, and I've come to think of the gallery space as almost a very quiet, contemplative space, although sometimes I'll bring projects into that space and sort of intervene. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about the musters was the idea of kind of directing but not scripting the event so that its outcome would only be revealed at the event itself. And so they're very, chaotic and unpredictable. And in terms of other kinds of projects coming up, since I've done those, I've been asked to do all kinds of other, kind of related projects. I did a large-scale project recently called The Cries of San Francisco that's based on the Cries of London, actually, but it invited people in San Francisco to take on these kind of peddler personae and kind of, peddle their wares. It combined kind of soapbox speech making with sculptural drag, and that was a quite big event that I did recently. So it just depends. Some other projects have been very intimate where I'll kind of, as I mentioned before, apprentice myself to someone, and it's really more about one-on-one interactions or small groups. So yeah, I find that if I'm working in the studio alone for too long, I get lonely. So I yearn for that kind of interaction and dialogue.
Yes, Paul.
I was going to ask you something, Julie. I was going to ask you whether you thought that this sort of show that you've curated, is it a sort of zeitgeist right now? Why you put it together particularly right now? Maybe the artists could maybe also talk about that.
Good question, thank you. Yes, I think it is in the zeitgeist right now. I sort of noticed it first about 10 years ago when young artists started doing strange things like making ceramics and carving wood and weaving and things, and it seemed very, at the time, a little, I don't want to say off-putting, but it was surprising, and especially in relationship to the very high-tech, high-fabrication 90s. Of course, this comes out of like a DIY aesthetic, but I think a lot of it also for me has to do with consumer culture as well, and this emphasis on the handcrafted. And I know you know that the marketers have picked up on this. Everything is handcrafted, from watches. Now watches are handcrafted. Oh, surprise! To beers, to spirits, and everything has handcrafted on it. So, and then of course with the advent of the scholarship that's been happening, and some exhibitions, actually, I will admit there have been some exhibitions, but probably the one that's most relevant to this one would be the one in Raven Row in 2010, Unto This Last. So I kind of felt like, okay, there's a moment here, and I think I can do something interesting with it that hasn't been done in the United States, at least. So how about you guys? Jane?
I think there is something actually interesting that's happening. I think for me, and I have to say this is just for me personally, the reason I love making things, it's fairly obvious, and I can't actually deny the impulse that I actually want to be in control of the making of my own work. And that's, for me, a very significant thing, because I think it does stand slightly askance to what I've seen, and certainly how art was made. So during the time that I was at art school, and certainly the way that I was taught, I always felt like, well, I have to think like this, I have to think in a very conceptual manner, and I just don't. And I think in a sense I was thinking, well, why is that? Why am I kind of, I don't think like this, but is there something deeper here that's actually more interesting? And I think what I was seeing was that a conceptual language, which is very dominant and has been very dominant for a long time, personally, I think it's a devalued language for making art now. I'm sorry, I know it would be contentious to say, but it certainly is for me, and certainly within the British context of art that we've seen during the 90s and into the noughties and the Brit art generation. They've kind of emptied out the whole language, which from the 60s and 70s was fantastically revolutionary and really, really was about challenging the marketplace for art, what that meant. You wanted to step outside of it. It was really kind of, I can imagine hugely exciting, and it really had a purpose, and it really had a focus. I certainly think that partly my discomfort with it is that, I do feel there's been this kind of emptying out, and now these things have become very much, or this way of making work has become very much about actually, the market again. And I think in a way, if you, it's not unusual, is it, to have a reaction in a sense? Perhaps it is a reaction, and perhaps actually a return to materiality and actually using things in a way that is very, very contemporary seems like a very clear route for artists. I mean, that's just my view of it, whether that makes sense or not, but it's certainly where I'm positioned and where I feel I am with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't show that discomfort. I think with the way a lot of art's gone in recent years, we all can think of artists who whose work is produced in factory conditions with teams of assistants. And I think there may well be a backlash against that. In my case, I don't think that's a conscious thing. I think it's just sheer bloody-mindedness on my part that I won't let anyone else touch what I'm doing. I think. And I always come up with excuses so that, it has to be in my handwriting, or that's a bit, I have a particular way of carving these apples, and nobody else can do it quite the same way. But in fact, I did a very large text piece after that. When you saw what I put on the walls, I was commissioned to make a piece for an art centre in Derry, in Northern Ireland. It was in 2004 because it was to that was the centenary of the year that James Joyce's Ulysses was set. And so I was asked by this centre in Derry, which is called the Urban Art Centre, which deals with literature, to do a text piece based on Ulysses. And so I wrote the whole of Ulysses onto the walls of this building. And I know another one. I'm such a masochist, yes. It took me a year to do this, but and I was offered assistance, and I of course refused them. But as I say, this is just blowing my funds.
That's a good subtitle, masochism. There's my subtitle. Masochism and contemporary.
You're doing well with that.
Allison, and then I think we might be done after that. So, sorry, I'm such a fashion.
Let's see. Well, as far as the kind of zeitgeist, I mean, I do feel that in my own practice, over the past 10 or 15 years, that some new conversations have emerged, or re-emerged around ideas of craft, which I think partially come out of slow food movements and DIY, and also feminist dialogue and kind of revisiting of feminist aesthetics from the late 60s and early 70s. And in addition to that, in my practice as well, the ideas around social practice or relational aesthetics. And it's always interesting as an artist to feel like you're kind of in the midst of a larger conversation. You're not sure, you're not doing it intentionally. And I don't think any artist would admit to trying to be part of a zeitgeist, really. It's just happening. But what I think is really interesting about this show is the particular take that you brought to it, Julie, to bring together ideas of craft and labor, because I have been in several shows, or I know about several shows that think about craft as a kind of celebration of kind of bygone traditions and artists who are doing that, and also this idea of posing craft against art. Of course, we've heard that a million times, and that persists, that idea. But the particular idea that can be kind of thorny to kind of put, or to really see craft and industry and the handmade and machine-made as not so different, really, in some ways. And to think about those things as much more closely aligned, or at least dependent on one another in our conception of what either one might be. And I mean, for me, I think that all art is collaborative, whether it's the person who sourced the materials that you bought at the art supply store, or the person who comes to the gallery to acknowledge what you've made as art and therefore completes the piece. And one of the things that draws me to craft practice historically is the idea of the workshop and the kind of, sharing and exchanging and conversation that goes on around and through the making of works. I find that really interesting. I think most of the time we have a kind of myth about the lone, artist, genius working away in the studio, and it's only with the studio craft movement that we think of craft in that way as well. People starting to sign their pots and everything. So, I don't know, I just think you've offered up a really rich set of questions that are by no means resolved, and no means, even resolved in this exhibition, but hopefully it will get people thinking.
Okay, well, that's a very lovely ending. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Jane. Thank you.